that if you do not wish to be seen during or heard during the event, during the talk, kindly switch off your microphones and also your video cameras. It will be on the spotlight view on our speaker. And at the end of tonight's event, tonight's talk, we will have a question session, so please feel free to interact. What you can do is type in your questions in the chat session, and I will either read them out if you're unable to unmute yourself, or I will call upon you to unmute yourself and ask our speaker your question yourself. And with that, I am delighted to introduce to you tonight Dr. Vicki Ann Cremona, who is currently at an academic at the University of Malta, and she is the chair of the School of Performing Arts and a professor within the Theatre Studies Department. She's also currently serving as a member of the Project on European Theatre Systems, or STEP, and also the Executive Committee for the International Federation of Theatre Research. Now, her primary research interests are actually focused on Maltese theatre history, and from what I understand from her CV, more recently focusing on North African theatre history as well. The historiography of theater, public performances, and the theater spaces, and how these are sort of intertwined with political power structures as well, which is a very interesting theme, as perhaps she will highlight to us later today. In fact, her latest book publication that came out in 2018, called Carnival and Power: Play and Politics in a Crown Colony, actually plays on theme of how theater and power are intertwined, exploring how the tradition of carnival in Malta actually played an important role in their struggle for independence from British colonization in the 1960s. Now, notably, Dr. Cremona has been serving as Ambassador of Malta to France between 2005 and 2009, and later on to Tunisia between 2009 and 2013. In fact, as she told me yesterday, the announcement of her being appointed as ambassador to France came along when she was at Lucy Cavendish College as a visiting scholar. Please do correct me if I'm wrong. And very, very honored indeed. Currently, she is also very active as the president of a civil society movement called Republica that started in 2018 in Malta with the aim of enhancing human rights and the principles of democracy in Malta. And today, she actually aims to tell us a little about her work with Republica in her talk titled Empowering Civil Society, Murder, Corruption, and Political Activism in Malta. And hopefully we will get a lovely taster of all of their efforts to take on the case of the heinous murder of this of investigative journalist Caruana Galizia, and in fact continue her struggle against state capture and how Republica has grown in itself. So I would like to hand over the stage to Dr. Cremona, and let's hear what she has to say. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, from very hot and sunny Malta. I think temperatures are a little bit different here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen with you. So just a minute. Here we are. Yeah. Okay. So my talk is entitled Empowering Civil Society, Murder, Corruption and Political Activism in Malta. It is a sort of work in progress of a paper that I am writing. In analyzing possible approaches to the relationship between rationalization, intended as forms of rationality, and excesses of power, the French philosopher Michel Foucault suggested a method that consists, I quote, of taking the forms of resistance against different forms of power as a starting point. He contended that power is exercised from innumerable points in the interplay of non-egalitarian and mobile relations. Public protest may be seen as a direct confrontation of non-egalitarian power relations, where civil society reacts to the exertion of power that is seen as biased or unjust by affirming its own identity and resistance to the effects of power. The protests in Malta that have taken place since 2017 may be seen as falling under Foucault's definition of immediate struggles that attack forms of power which proliferate what he calls secrecy, deformation, and mystifying representations imposed on people. The warped versions of the truth that have been held up to the public have tried to cover a long list of corrupt practices by members of the highest echelons of the police force, state institutions and government, including ministers, the Chief of Staff of the Office of the Prime Minister, and possibly the Prime Minister himself. Corruption, as sociologist Donatella Della Porta claims, is considered as a crime of calculation. In Malta, this led to the assassination of a journalist who was unveiling various instances of individual and collective corruption. Her barbaric death triggered relational dynamics, as Della Porta calls them, among individuals who have joined together and through empowering collective action uphold her memory and have taken up her fight to help bring into the open the corruption, conflicts of interest, and revolving door policies that were and still are being surreptitiously practiced. This paper will focus on one particular organization representing civil society, Repubblica, and its partner, informal grouping, Occupy Justice. It will discuss civil protest action in the light of a theatrical event in order to analyze the participant-spectator dynamics and ostentatious action that is intended to transform perception and lead to the overthrow of the forces generating corruption. One of the limitations of this study derives from the fact that I myself form part of this movement and am currently the president of Repubblica. The president is changed every year. My presentation does not try to dissimulate my political bias. On the contrary, I see it as a form of activism to generate new knowledge and understanding about the causes and manifestations of protest by civil society in Malta. As Foucault contends, there is no power relation, I quote, there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. I shall now speak about the triggering factors, the assassination. So this is, as you can see, one of our demonstrations, and these are the two organizations that have organized it, and this is me actually giving, addressing the public. The International Federation of Journalists poses the ethical principles of journalism as, I quote, truth, independence, and the need to minimize harm. Journalists across the world have become prime targets for attack and assassination when the stories they tell pinpoint political or social abuse of power and restriction of freedom and justice. 53-year-old investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was no exception. She was blown up in her car on 16 October 2017. A car bomb placed under the driver's seat was detonated a few meters away from her house as she was on her way to the bank after her assets were frozen in a libel case instituted by the then Minister for the Economy, Chris Cardona. She has been described as Malta's most fearless journalist by her admirers, but labelled as a witch by pro-government media and supporters. A graduate in archaeology with a minor in anthropology, Daphne, as everyone knew her, ran a blog called Running Commentary through which she would attack and denounce corrupt politicians, businessmen, and anyone connected to their murky business. Certainly, in the last years of her life, her blog was the most widely read news source in Malta and beyond, as she revealed scandal upon scandal concerning the links between Malta's political and business worlds. As her youngest son, Paul, himself a journalist, affirms, and I quote, "In Malta, everyone read Daphne. Our surname was redundant. In a country of 475,000 people, her website received 400,000 unique visitors a day, more than 1 million during election campaigns, and a greater number than the combined readership of all Malta's dailies. She refused media appearances and resented the interest in her life over her work, saying that things in Malta were so depressing, so predictably rotten, that she had become for what passed as a celebrity there." End quote. Her writing was direct, incisive, and vicious. At the time of her death, 42 libel suits had been instituted against her. This meant that according to Maltese law, which puts libel suits at par with civil debt recovery, after her death, her family inherited the onus of having to appear in court to continue fighting to clear her name. Her main targets were the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, and his direct entourage, his chief of staff, members of his cabinet, and his wife, Michelle. Daphne also attacked members of the main party in opposition, in particular its leader, Adrian Delia, and officials of state institutions, including judges and magistrates, for corrupt practices. She wrote about Maltese and foreign businessmen who were involved in highly corrupt affairs, and 2 banks suspected of money laundering. They have both been closed down. Events that have developed after her death have shown that although she was accused of lying and unjustly tarnishing Malta's reputation, most of her revelations were true. Erstwhile Prime Minister Joseph Muscat, then leader of the Maltese Labour Party, came to power in 2013 at the age of 39, after he had served as a member of the European Parliament between 2004 and 2008. He was Prime Minister of Malta from 2013 to December 2019, when he was forced to resign following pressure by thousands of protesters standing for days in front of the Parliament building, due to the revelations that linked his Chief of Staff, Keith Schembri, and at least one of his ministers, Conrad Mitzi, and possibly the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Chris Cardona, also a former minister, to a prominent businessman, Jorgen Fenech, who was charged with complicity in Daphne's murder. The whole affair made world news, with newspapers and media such as the New York Times, The Guardian, Corriere della Sera, Le Monde, El País, Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC reporting the matter. The Al Jazeera portal bore the news under the general heading of News Corruption. The corruption spread far and wide. Mitzi and Schembri had already been denounced by Daphne as having a secret account in Panama, which was revealed as part of the international scandal known as Panama Papers. Investigative work by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ, leading to the scandal known as the Paradise Papers, showed that these accounts were supposed to be fed by kickbacks to the tune of 5,000 euros a day from a new company called Electrogas, managed by business tycoon and murder suspect Jorgen Fenech, which was supposed to was Malta's gas and electricity company, and involving a consortium of business companies that included the top echelons of power in Azerbaijan. These money transfers were to be conducted through a company he owned called 17 Black. Other scandals included the sale of Maltese passports to Russian and Chinese oligarchs, the sale of 3 public hospitals to a foreign private entity, and brokering a similar deal with officials from Montenegro, making secret agreements to sell medical visas to Libyans wanting to come over to Europe. The list seems endless to anyone trying to make sense of what Malta and its reputation have been exposed to. 5 days after Daphne's murder, a group of protesters, this is Jorgen Fennig, the businessman, and this is one element of his huge business affairs, which actually deal with hotels, property, boats, yachts, you name it. 5 days after Daphne's murder, a group of protesters gathered in front of the police headquarters demanding the resignation of Police Commissioner Lawrence Kutayar, whose photo you see there. 4 days later, 10 days after the murder, on the 26th October 2017, a group of women under the collective name of Occupy Justice, who defined themselves as non-partisan, protested by camping for 4 days outside the Prime Minister's office, denouncing impunity and calling for constitutional reform. A core group who slept in tents on the square were joined at all times of day and night by other women, some with babies and young children, and men who showed solidarity to their cause. Some of the women from OJ, as they are known, together with a small number of persons, went on to found the civil society voluntary organization called Republica. Republica's statute describes the organization in this way. I quote, "The association is composed of individuals who act independently of government and other interests and seeks to promote civil rights, democratic life, rule of law, free speech, personal freedom, social inclusion, environmental conservation, economic sustainability, and equality of access, by means of active participation in the national discourse and related educational, social, and charitable initiatives." End quote. International scandals like the Panama Papers have fueled the condemnation of collusive spaces and revolving doors, with the added effect of promoting resistance by civil society rather than, I quote, "delegating the fight for transparency to big repressive apparatuses." Since its inception in January 2019, civil society movement Republica has participated in the social discourse in a number of ways, organizing and staging a large number of protests, publishing, excuse me, publishing articles in leading newspapers and blogs, and organizing a discussion program on their Facebook page regarding emerging scandals in order to combat the silence of the national media on political corruption. It has taken the government to court on various counts of corruption. It has even gone so far as to take one of its causes involving the partisan selection of the Maltese judiciary to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. Republica is a non-partisan organization which defends the rule of law in a country that is radically split into 2 opposing political factions, Labour and Nationalist. Although other voluntary organizations in Malta have fought political battles, these are linked to the environment, the rights of illegal migrants, heritage, etc., but have not directly confronted government on corruption and the rule of law. Thanks to its multiple actions and the weak party in opposition, the organization is today viewed as the principal challenge to government by governmental authorities themselves. Staging a protest requires an organizational structure, a degree of financial resources, and much preparatory work that goes beyond the protest itself. Republica is structured into a core group or committee composed of 13 members, which works on the basis of egalitarian principles, but has an informal hierarchy with a president-elect, a treasurer, and a secretary general. The different members are responsible for various tasks that help raise awareness of their confrontational initiatives against corrupt power. The German sociologist Dieter Rucht highlights the backstage of a protest and lists some of the work involved as follows. Countless, I quote, countless phone calls, numerous meetings with potential contributors and donors, challenging discussions among organizing individuals and groups about the right place and time for the event, its forms of protest, key slogans, the wording of flyers, organizing the erection of a stage and sound system, as well as the speakers and performers on stage, accepting or rejecting restrictions levied by authorities, organizing a press conference before the event, negotiating with the police on the spot, and so on, end quote. I shall now be speaking of civil society protest as a theatrical event. An organized protest is a power-wielding strategy that holds attention, sets an example, diffuses knowledge, and rallies people to a cause. It may be seen as a stage action that involves multiple actors whose aim is to be watched by targeted spectators, individuals or authorities, against whom they protest. This type of civic involvement is integrated into the public sphere as a communicative engagement between actor and spectator that requires the protesters' rational consensus towards a particular cause, which is rendered public through their physical presence and participation in the protest. The predominant sentiments that protesters wish to transmit are strength and fearlessness, aimed to instill a degree of concern and anxiety in these powerful spectators, which should push the latter to take the action the protesters are demanding. Protesters also target other spectators by trying to rouse their awareness of the issue at hand through their action, with the ultimate aim of helping them form a similar opinion and, as a result, possibly shift to a more participatory role. Like all other stage actions, a protest presents itself through what theatre studies theorist Vilma Sauter calls exhibitory actions that are articulated on three levels: sensory, artistic, and symbolic. The sensory level focuses on the type of presence that is staged by the protesters and the way it is perceived both mentally and physically. The number of protesters appeals directly on an emotional and visual level. The greater the number, the bigger the challenge they pose is perceived, as performance brings questions of scale into play. The type of behavior they adopt also adds to the sensory perception, whether violent or peaceful, loud or silent. The artistic level may be linked to the aesthetics of presence through the actions undertaken, the objects carried, and the type of appearance assumed. The symbolic level may be related to ritualistic actions which may be used to create a framework for the protest, as well as a tool to transmit opposition to a dominant power. Protest action manifests its counterpower through the appropriation of public space that is transformed into the space of contestation. Like the opening of the curtain in a theatre, appropriation of the public space marks the beginning of the action to be performed that is intended to deliver the political message. The protesters' act of assembly provides meaning and intensity to the event. The actual gathering of people is a show of force, where real time is subordinated to the extra daily time of political action. Since the principal theatre of protest is usually the street, a space that is at the core of everyday life and its happenings, the act of occupying this space creates a direct visual confrontation between the everyday and the extra daily happening of protest. Through its very presence, the gathering, whether large or small, challenges the everyday routine occupation of space, and through this, citizen indifference or tacit submission to a state of affairs that is sustained by the apparent normality of things going on as usual. Spatial transformation is both physical, through the very act of occupation by the protesters, and performative, through the different ways in which collective assertion is foregrounded through this extra daily presence. Repubblica has generally rendered space performative by exploiting existing raised spots in the capital Valletta to set its stages, such as the stairs placed before a large monument facing the law courts, or those leading to the Prime Minister's office. On certain occasions, a large or small platform has been specially erected. The space of assembly becomes a focal point for any initiative expressing dissent and denunciation. Although spectator protester gatherings do not follow any regimented order, particular elements in protest actions assume ritualistic characteristics, especially when the protests occur more frequently. These rituals provide stable points within the more or less spontaneous development of the protests, creating structure for the immediacy of the evolving action. The Maltese authorities' initial studied indifference to the journalist's death was contrasted by forms of protest that were ritualized both through the time and place of staging. Ritual events in the form of monthly vigils began to be held on the anniversary of Daphne's assassination. The set time and place helped not only to create identification and unity among the social group, but facilitated the growth of the movement itself through the feeling of communitas generated by collective presence. This led to the formation of a community spirit that provided a collective outlet for the free expression of emotion and anger at the vilification of the journalist during her lifetime and after her cruel death. The lack or slowness of investigations and magisterial inquiries, and to the enactment of symbolic resistance to the still undefined powers that willed her murder. The place chosen is itself symbolic, a monument representing faith, fortitude, and civilization, situated just across the street from the National Law Courts, in order to remind one and all that justice for Daphne Caruana Galizia still has not been done. The vigil itself is ritually structured. Protesters gather in the evening at a set time around the monument and place photos, candles, and flowers in front of it, and speeches are given highlighting state corruption and impunity. Speakers, mainly Maltese coming from different walks of life, have also included foreign journalists, politicians, and political activists. The protest ends with the singing of the national anthem, which, apart from the sensory function of creating a unison of voices in harmony, assumes the symbolic function of solidarity and affirmation of a collective identity with which to confront those in power. The line of action that transforms the space into a site of contestation has encountered strong counter-resistance from government, especially with regard to the ritual space itself around the monument. In an article about controversial outsider art, Daniel Wojcik describes institutional behavior that could be compared to that shown in Malta, where protest also generated hostilities from institutions and authorities that attempted to regulate the ideas expressed, actually ordering the environments to be demolished. Government action can be viewed as a form of censorship, exercised as in the case of forced closure of theatres on the space itself, in view of stopping all resistance activity. For 16 months, from September 2018 to January 2020, the photos, candles, and flowers placed by protesters were removed by order of the then Minister of Justice, Owen Bonnici. This gave rise to another ritual of defiance, that of replacing the candles and flowers every single day, for them to be cleared every night. The confrontation of power and resistance was reciprocal, with different contrasting strategies being deployed. The minister had the National Heritage Department declare that the monument, recently restored, needed fresh restoration, and as a pretext, put up hoarding around it. This is a picture of a book that has been published called Murder on the Malta Express by John Sweeney, one of our members, Delia and Manuel Delia, and this is Manuel Delia's blog called Truth Be Told. The protesters so the minister actually put hoarding around the monument. The protesters first exploited the hoarding to increase the visual aspect of their protests by fixing photos and messages to it, and eventually brought down the hoarding and invaded the space of the monument in a show of force. One of the members of Repubblica, Manuel Delia, who was also the writer of a very popular blog, went so far as to challenge the minister over the violation of his right to protest in the Constitutional Court, and 14 months later won his case. Protest, like any other theatrical event, is of the here and now, but its effects are intended to raise awareness, create visibility, and bring about change. Creative action helps to transmit more effectively critical considerations that develop knowledge, which, as Foucault argues, is the key to power. To be effective, performance must, I quote, somehow connect with the audience's ideology or ideologies, as Baz Kershaw states. In Malta's environment, where ideology is often formed by an unwavering familial affiliation to political parties from one generation to the next, it is difficult to overcome partisan conviction, even when confronted by deducible proof. Moreover, corruption requires complex stratification to dissimulate itself behind respectable appearances, making it more difficult to detect. Creative action may help deploy knowledge in forms that are easily apprehended and generate curiosity, interest, participation in the experience, as well as memory of the event. The type of protest staged by Occupy Justice functions through what Ward calls micro-mobilization, that relies less on collective presence, but rather on individuals or small groupings, which in this case is composed mainly of women. A good number of those forming the core of the group come from the world of theatre or the visual arts, and have chosen to transmit their message of resistance by what they have called actions. The creative process focuses on spectacular action relying on aesthetical qualities, often aimed to name and shame, that depends on surprise, irony, and that is based on surprise, irony, and humor. These actions are performed rapidly at unexpected times and are intended mainly for the camera. The daring creative aspect of the actions is used to attract friendly newspapers to publish the photographs, which are accompanied by a statement, thereby transmitting the group's confrontational messages vis-à-vis corrupt power to a wide public. In one of their actions, women wearing dark clothes and hoodies stormed all the main monuments across Malta and covered them with t-shirts bearing the last words written by Daphne in her blog minutes before her assassination. And I quote them, "There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate." In another action, they put up posters that closely resembled those of well-known films, but changed the faces to those men they denounced as politically corrupt, with captions underneath clearly stating their message. They have also demonstrated various times on the steps of the Prime Minister's office. In one case, wearing masks reproducing pigs' heads and holding up placards with the names of politicians, officials, and businessmen whose names emerge in every corruption scandal. It is, however, repeated mass mobilization, especially in front of Parliament, that has contributed most effectively to capturing international press attention and brought political change, albeit limited, in Malta. Most notably, it led to the resignation of Prime Minister Joseph Muscat. These mass gatherings were fueled by the corruption scandals emerging from the trial of suspected murder mastermind Jorgen Fenech, involving the top echelons of power in money laundering, misappropriation of funds, and many other instances of power abuse. Paulo Gerbaudo's reference to corruption in Spain, denounced by the grassroots movement Democracia Realia, can well apply to the Maltese context. Some of us have clearly defined ideologies. I'm quoting his denunciation. Some of us have clearly defined ideologies. Others are apolitical, but we are all concerned and angry about the political, economic, and social outlook which we see around us. Corruption among politicians, businessmen, bankers, leaving us helpless without a voice. The mass protests organized by Repubblica gave a voice to a public that had little means of otherwise manifesting its condemnation. The spectacle of the sheer size of the crowd has not only provided color and noise with its banners, flags, placards, whistles, and beating of pots and pans, but created a visible mass of dissension. A certain degree of mesomobilization, as Gerhardt and Rucht call it, that involves other groups joining forces by their presence in the demonstrations, although not necessarily in the preparatory phase, helped to increase crowd numbers, ages, and social provenance. The spatial dynamics were very important, not only when the crowd functioned as a moving cortege, but even more when it occupied proximity to institutional spaces, such as the square in front of the Prime Minister's office or that in front of Parliament. In the latter case, collective power was pitted against institutional power, each resisting the other, the former through its rowdy presence, the latter through the impressive amount of crash barriers placed in front of Parliament, the likes of which had never been seen or experienced in Malta. The overwhelming spatial configuration of the barriers in front of Parliament may be seen as a spectacular strategic move on the part of the authorities to discourage the crowd. It had the opposite effect of fueling the crowd's anger, adding to the energy and intensity of the demonstrators' presence and nurturing emotional empathy within the crowd. Moreover, on one occasion, it led the demonstrators to use non-violent tactics to disarm the powerful, trapping them for hours within the limited space of the square and the Parliament building itself. Every entrance to the square was blocked by large numbers of protesters who would sit down in a tight mass every time a politician tried to exit. Very few people were allowed to cross from the site of power to the space of the people. Collective resistance created a sense of empowerment within the crowd and strong emotions of anger and frustration from the political side. As the magisterial and public inquiries into the murder progress, more and more stories of corruption and cover-up unfold. However, it is the gruesome spectacularity of Daphne's assassination and the constant performance of protest that have captured the attention of the world beyond Malta's shores. Protests provide visual spectacle for newsreels. Shots of protests, especially those in front of Parliament, have been shown across the world. The theatricality of protest, therefore, has proved to be an effective way of bringing Malta to the attention of the man in the street in Europe and beyond. For a small island like Malta, which normally passes unnoticed by world news spotlights, capturing international attention on matters of power is of vital importance. It is certainly a major form of resistance to corrupt power, which prefers to operate in the shadows. Being in the limelight places the country under international scrutiny. Daphne's death has led to the examination of the Maltese constitution by the European Commission of Democracy through Law, better known as the Venice Commission, an advisory body of the Council of Europe. Even though the government continues to drag its feet with regard to public consultation, the Venice Commission is discussing constitutional reform not only with government bodies, but also with civil society. And a little bracket about this, Repubblica sent a 24-page response to the Venice Commission with regard to government's reform proposals, and the Commission's reply to government shows that these were read very carefully. Another body of the Council of Europe, the Committee of Experts on the Evaluation of Anti-Money Laundering Measures and the Financing of Terrorism, better known as MONEYVAL, has called upon the Maltese authorities to strengthen measures to combat and prosecute money laundering and reinforce its supervisory system. And there is the possibility of the country being grey-listed unless urgent measures are taken. Focus on Malta has attracted international journalists' attention to political corruption in Malta. And this has made people realize that political dishonesty, even in a tiny country, has complex international ripple effects that cannot be disregarded. This attention has generated interest in court cases instituted by Repubblica, in particular those regarding judicial appointments and the pushback of illegal immigrants. It has also made our political leaders more conscious of the fact that we are not alone in resisting their distortion of the democratic process. International attention has also begun to provide positive consequences. As more knowledge about the country is diffused, more resistance is mustered, and the combat continues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicki. That was absolutely brilliant, and it's very heartening to hear all of the work that that your organization, Repubblica, has been doing to fight injustice at the very sort of grassroots level. Right now, I'd like to open up the stage for questions. We already have a couple of questions, so we'll get started on that. And if you have any questions, please do type it out in the chat function, and then I will ask you to either unmute yourself and ask the question, or I can read it out. If necessary, we can also extend the session by an extra few minutes in order to cover the questions as best as we can. So to start off with, we have an anonymous question from one of our participants. And they want to know if you think whether journalists now in Malta, if they feel safe enough to continue in their traditional role as confronters or critics of those in power as a result of Repubblica's civil society activities, such as all the protests you described today, and also do the protests, etc., give the journalists a sense of safety in numbers? If you could elaborate on that.
Well, it's an important question. First of all, it's important to know that there are two categories of newspapers and of televisions and radios in Malta. there is the free press, the independent press, which, however, depends also on government for advertising and for other means, which is not financed by government, though, only indirectly. And also there is a partisan press which belongs to the two main political parties. We have inherited a two-party system from colonial rule. And therefore, and each of the political parties has its own television and its own newspaper. They are both in Maltese, whilst most of the independent press is in English. And they all and basically the state television is generally taken over practically by the government in power. So Republica has made various appeals and has written to the police demanding protection for our independent journalists, particularly for those continuing to conduct investigative journalism and denouncing corruption. Also, Maltese journalists have, some Maltese journalists, particularly those belonging to the Times of Malta, are part of the international consortium of journalists that has been formed after Daphne Caruana Galizia's death to continue and are investigating into things like Panama Papers or Paradise Papers and into other forms of corruption, not only in relation to Malta, but in relation to other countries in the world. So yes, we are very concerned. We are demanding police protection. The former police commissioner who resigned recently is being revealed as having been very corrupt. We have a new police commissioner and we are watching him very closely, but he's only assumed his position last week. So, you know, we have to keep vigilant.
Thank you. We have another question from Helen Anderson. Helen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, or should I just read it out?
I'm happy to ask it. Vicki Ann, great to hear from you. I'm in New Zealand, so another very small country where it isn't yet 6 a.m. and it is rather chilly, I have to say. but my question relates really to the size of the protest relative to the community. And so this protest movement in Malta looks quite large relative to the size of the community, whereas in much bigger economies, very huge protests seem to lack that use of the creative theatrical elements that you've described. So is this only possible in a small economy?
I wouldn't quite agree with you that you know, other larger countries lack creativity. Depending where. I have watched you know, protests in France, for example, when they were not violent, but which have had, and in Italy, which have had people singing, dancing, etc. And when we think of the anti-Vietnam protests in America, these gave rise to huge theatre companies, like important theatre companies rather than huge, like Living Theatre, or like Richard Schechner's Ulysses 69, I believe it was called. I might have got the name wrong, but so there is a certain amount of thinking behind generating more interest and more verve within a protest. Obviously, in Malta, on the contrary, I feel that we have to include more theatricality now, and we are actually looking at the possibility of creating sketches within the protest itself in order to introduce humor. you know, because there is a certain amount of amusement, especially, I could see it, especially when we locked the parliamentarians in Parliament. People were actually joking about it, and the jokes carried on even after the protest. So I think the introduction of humor would be very good within a protest. It would create irony. And irony is a very good form of resistance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicki. And we have the next question from Megan. Megan, would you be able to unmute yourself? Megan. Shall I just read the question out then in the interest of time? Okay. So Megan wants to know, I see. She thanks you for your fascinating talk. And what she wants to know is if you have any recommendations for Maltese literature originally written in English, including drama, particularly which relate to Malta as a crown colony and about Maltese independence.
Well, Maltese literature relating to Malta as a crown colony, yes, there's tons written in English. I have some. I mean, if I switched my computer to my library, I could show you. There's a lot of literature written about. I'm trying to read the titles, but I'm a bit short-sighted. So, you know, there is Henry Frindo's Malta as a fortress colony. There is. Yes, a lot of Maltese intellectuals have written, particularly Maltese historians have written about the colonial experience. Obviously, my book is also about the colonial experience, which the British colonial experience dates from 1800 to 1964, and I look at it through the lens of Carnival. But I'm looking at the notions of power and resistance through that. I could send a bibliography if anyone was interested, but I must say at the University Library in Cambridge, there are quite a few books on written by Maltese historians on the colonial experience.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions at all?
Sorry, with regard to drama, Maltese drama is written in Maltese. So I'm afraid there isn't any drama, as far as I know, that is written in English, except for the Christmas pantomime, but that's which is an inherited British tradition.
Megan says thank you, and she's very interested because she's been struggling to find books online, and she promises to look in the library when we're back at the university.
I will send her a bibliography.
Yes. Yeah, if you would like to send us that, we can actually post it on the link when we publish this event
Okay.
On the Lucy Cavendish website.
Would it be immodest of me if I put my book in as well?
Not at all. We would be very interested in reading your book.
I sent a copy to Lucy Cavendish College, so it should be in the library.
Okay, excellent. Yes, and if there's an ebook, we should definitely like to include a link to that as well.
Yes, there's an ebook.
Much appreciated. So if there are no more questions, I'll just finish with one last question. So clearly a lot of your interests in general, what you've outlined to us in terms of what the civil society has been, how it's been functioning is essentially theatrics, but on a very grand scale. And it's all about making a scene, like essentially getting the message across to politicians, be it through Carnival during the time of colonialization or now to your modern day politicians. Have you ever thought about using the medium of theater and plays at the smaller scale for education purposes, so people don't forget the lessons they've learned now? Have you ever tried to implement that in your department at all?
Well, actually, rather than implement that in our department, what is interesting is that our former students are actually writing plays about denouncing political abuse and as well as social abuse. I'm thinking in particular of one playwright who is one of the leading playwrights at the moment. Her name is Simone Spiteri, and she has written a whole series of plays, but one in particular which has really denounced political corruption. However, I must say that we have a very conflictual situation in Malta at the moment with regard to theatre, because the governmental structures, the state structures that are in charge of the arts are completely hijacked by pro-government officials who are very hostile to any anti-government manifestation, even if this is artistic, and who have been openly hostile to the people who actually express anti-government ideas. I, for example, have been very highly attacked on Facebook, which seems to be the general communicative medium in Malta. I don't have Facebook myself, but I've been highly attacked by one government official who is the chairman of one of the arts organizations, national organizations in Malta, and by the artistic director of that organization. And the attacks were so vicious that what I was pleased about was the fact that many people rose to my defense and asked Facebook to shut down the blog, and it was shut down for 48 hours. So, but yes, there is this problem actually. In fact, the artistic director of this organization actually presented a play, wanted to present a play. He presented the script to the National Theatre about Daphne's murder, but interpreting it in looking at her as though she is, looking at her from a very negative point of view. It seems it was so shocking that they rejected it. But what I wrote an article in the Times of Malta, which you can Google, called "Of Bitches and Witches," in which I attack these two persons in particular.
Thank you. I will definitely Google "Of Bitches and Witches." Oh, thank you very much, Vicki. And that was an absolutely enlightening talk. And thank you to all who attended today. And
thank you all for your interest.
And this talk will be available once Vicki has published her work on YouTube, but hopefully we'll be able to publish details of this talk on our website as well. And I hope that you will be able to check that out on the Lucy Cavendish website. Next week, same time, same place. That is Zoom. We shall welcome one of our own fellows, Dr. Niamh Mulcahy, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you.